In 2014, scientists ran the DNA of 150,000 people who all checked the same box on a census form. What they found inside that DNA didn't just surprise the researchers, it rewrote entire family histories overnight. These weren't strangers pulled off the street. They were customers of a genetic testing company, ordinary people who had spit into a tube, sealed it up, and mailed it off just to satisfy a bit of curiosity. Maybe they wanted to know if they were part Irish. Maybe they wanted a fun fact for a family reunion. Most of them expected a tidy little pie chart confirming what they already believed about themselves. Instead, they got something far stranger. Hidden inside the genetic code of thousands of people who had spent their entire lives identifying as one thing was a chapter of ancestry nobody had told them about. Grandparents who were never mentioned. Great-great-grandparents whose existence had been quietly erased from the family story. DNA does not forget, and in this study, it started talking. The researchers behind the project were population geneticists, the kind of scientists who spend their careers tracing the invisible threads that connect every human being on the planet. They partnered with a genetic testing company and pulled data from a massive pool of participants, all of whom had done two things: submitted a saliva sample for full genetic analysis, and filled out a questionnaire describing how they identified themselves racially and ethnically. On paper, this looks like a simple comparison. On one side, you have what people believe about their own ancestry. On the other side, you have what their DNA actually says. The gap between those two things turned out to be the real story. Before we get to the results, it helps to understand what your DNA can even tell a scientist in the first place. Every person's genome is a patchwork, stitched together from the genomes of the people who came before them. When your parents had you, each of them passed down roughly half of their own genetic material. Their DNA, in turn, was a blend of their two parents, and so on, generation after generation, stretching back further than any family Bible or ancestry chart could ever record. The further back you go, the more ancestors are technically contributing to what makes you, you. By the time you reach 10 generations back, you technically have over 1,000 ancestors feeding into your genetic code, even though most of us can barely name our own great-grandparents. Modern genetic analysis works by comparing small variations in DNA, called markers, against large reference databases built from people with well-documented ancestry from specific regions of the world. If your DNA contains a cluster of markers that show up frequently in West African populations, geneticists can flag that as a signal of West African ancestry, even if you have never set foot on that continent, and even if nobody in your living memory ever mentioned a connection to it. The technology does not care what stories your family has told for generations. It only reads what is actually written in the code. Think about it this way. A family tree drawn on paper only stretches as far back as somebody bothered to write things down, and written records fail constantly. Documents burn in fires. Immigration officials misspell names on arrival. Enslaved people were, for generations, deliberately stripped of any paper trail connecting them to their own ancestors. Wars scatter families across borders and oceans, severing connections that might never be reconstructed through paperwork alone. DNA does not carry any of those weaknesses. It survives fires, it survives border crossings, it survives the deliberate erasure of names and records, because it is not written on paper at all. It is written into the biological structure of every cell in your body, copied and passed down with a level of permanence that no archive could ever match. And that is exactly why this particular study became so significant. The sample size was enormous, drawing in more than 150,000 people who identified as white, along with several thousand additional participants who identified as Latino or African American. These people came from all across the United States, representing 48 different states, urban centers and rural towns, coastal cities and inland farmland. When the geneticists cross-referenced each person's DNA against their self-reported racial identity, a pattern began to emerge that many historians had been arguing for years, but had never been able to prove with hard biological evidence. Nearly 4% of people who identified as white carried detectable African ancestry in their genetic code. 4% might not sound like a dramatic number at first, but when you are talking about a population sample of 150,000 people, that translates into thousands of individuals living their entire lives unaware that a chapter of their ancestry had been left out of the story they were told. For some of them, it was a small trace, a whisper from many generations back. For others, the signal was strong enough to suggest a much closer connection, someone within just a few generations whose identity had been folded quietly into the family's past and never spoken of again. What made the discovery even more compelling was that it was not evenly distributed. The frequency of hidden African ancestry among white participants varied dramatically depending on where in the country they were from. In certain southern states, the numbers were staggering compared to the national average. In South Carolina and Louisiana, researchers found that as many as 12% of self-identified white participants carried African ancestry, 3 times the overall rate found across the country. That is not a random statistical blip. That is a genetic fingerprint of history itself, written into millions of strands of DNA and passed down through generation after generation without most people ever realizing it was there. To understand why the numbers cluster so heavily in the South, you have to look at the actual history of those regions. Louisiana and South Carolina were both centers of the American slave trade, places where the population of enslaved Africans and African Americans was, for long stretches of history, equal to or even greater than the population of white residents. Relationships between these populations, consensual and otherwise, occurred across generations, and the descendants of those unions did not always stay within the same community or maintain the same racial identity as their parents. Over decades, and then centuries, some of those family lines shifted their self-identification, sometimes by choice and sometimes because of the brutal racial laws that governed who was legally allowed to be considered white in America. Ancestors get folded into new identities. Names get changed. Communities relocate. And through all of that social reshuffling, the DNA stayed exactly the same, quietly recording every branch of the family tree, whether anyone chose to acknowledge it or not. This is where the study stopped being just a genetics paper and started becoming a conversation piece for historians as well. One historian who reviewed the findings pointed out that for an entire generation, scholars had been writing books arguing that race is not a fixed biological category, but rather a cultural and social construction that has shifted dramatically depending on the era, the region, and the laws in place at the time. What this DNA research did was take that argument out of the academic textbooks and put it directly into biological evidence. It used a completely different tool, genetic analysis, to arrive at the exact same conclusion. Historians had been reaching through archival records and oral histories. The two fields, working independently with completely different methods, landed on the same fundamental truth about how fluid and constructed racial categories in America have always been. Now, here is where the story gets even more interesting, because this particular study was only scratching the surface of a much bigger scientific reality. If you zoom out from questions of hidden ancestry within the United States and look at the broader picture of human genetic diversity across the entire species, the results become even more startling. For decades, there has been a persistent myth, one that still shows up in casual conversation today, that different racial groups carry fundamentally different amounts of genetic diversity, or that genetic differences between groups are large enough to sort humanity into neat, separate categories. Population geneticists have spent years dismantling that myth with hard data, and the picture that emerges is almost the exact opposite of what most people assume. One landmark genetic diversity study analyzed the genomes of individuals of European ancestry alongside individuals of African American ancestry, screening across 10,000 different genes. The European ancestry group showed dramatically less genetic variation among those genes compared to the African American group. At first glance, researchers expected this. It lines up with what scientists already understood about human migration history. But then came the twist nobody anticipated. The European ancestry group also carried significantly more potentially harmful genetic mutations than the African ancestry group did. That part caught scientists off guard. The explanation traces back tens of thousands of years to the moment when a relatively small group of early humans left the African continent and began spreading out across the rest of the world. Every population that exists outside of Africa today descends from that original migrating group, and because it was a limited number of people compared to the population that remained on the African continent, the genetic diversity carried by that founding group was naturally narrower. Geneticists call this a founder effect. Imagine an enormous, richly varied deck of cards, and then imagine someone pulling out just a fraction of those cards to start an entirely new game somewhere else. The new game can only ever contain the variety present in that smaller starting hand. Every non-African population on Earth today is, in a very real genetic sense, playing with a smaller hand than the one that stayed behind. Because the population that migrated out of Africa was smaller, natural selection had fewer chances to filter out harmful mutations before they became locked into the growing gene pool. Geneticists describe this using an interesting metaphor, calling it a kind of genetic echo, a lingering biological trace of the moment Europe and other regions were first settled by relatively small founding populations thousands of years ago. Meanwhile, the African population that never left maintained a much larger and more genetically diverse group, which gave natural selection far more raw material to work with over time, allowing harmful mutations to be filtered out more efficiently across the generations. It helps to picture the whole process like water flowing through a series of narrowing pipes. The population that stayed in Africa is the wide reservoir at the source, holding the fullest possible range of genetic variation that our species has ever produced. Every time a group broke off and pushed into new territory, whether crossing into the Middle East, spreading through Europe, moving into Central Asia, or eventually reaching the Americas, the stream of genetic material passing through that particular pipe got narrower. Fewer individuals meant fewer versions of each gene making the journey. And once a version of a gene failed to make it into a founding group, it simply was not there anymore to reappear in their descendants, no matter how many generations followed. This is why researchers can look at raw genetic diversity numbers today and essentially reconstruct the order in which different regions of the world were settled by early human populations without needing a single written record or archaeological site to confirm it. The DNA itself lays out the migration map. Even the Cornell-led research that first identified this pattern in Europeans found something else worth pausing on. The scientists noted that Native American populations show even less genetic diversity than European populations do, a finding that tracks perfectly with the idea of successive founder events. If European populations descended from a relatively small group that branched off from a larger African population, then Native American populations descended from an even smaller group, a few thousand people, who crossed into North America by way of a land bridge roughly 10,000 years ago. Each step of that migration acted like another narrowing pipe, another filter, reducing the range of genetic material carried forward into the next chapter of human history. A separate, even larger study reinforced this same pattern on a global scale. Researchers analyzed genetic samples from nearly 500 individuals scattered across the entire world, all of whom had contributed their DNA to a major international database. Consistent with what evolutionary biologists had long predicted, through the theory that modern humans originated in Africa before spreading outward, the study found that African populations carried the greatest amount of genetic diversity of any region on Earth. Middle Eastern populations came in second, reflecting their position as one of the earliest stops along the migration route out of Africa. European populations followed after that, and other regions fell into place based roughly on how far their ancestors had traveled from that original point of origin. Stop and actually sit with what that means for a moment. The farther a population's ancestors traveled from Africa, generation after generation, the less genetic diversity the population tends to carry today. It is almost like genetic diversity works as a kind of measuring stick for how long ago a group's ancestors branched off from the original human population. Every non-African person alive today is, genetically speaking, descended from a relatively small offshoot of a much larger and more diverse African population that never left. This single fact completely upends the outdated notion that different races represent separate, deeply divided branches of the human family tree. In reality, the opposite is true. Every population outside of Africa is genetically nested within African diversity. There is no independent European genetic lineage that stands apart from African ancestry. No separate Asian lineage branching off on its own path, unconnected to the rest. Every single lineage traces directly back through Africa. In a very real, scientifically provable sense, every person alive today, no matter their skin color, no matter their continent of origin, is African. Some family lines simply left more recently than others, and some never left at all. This idea is not some fringe theory whispered about in obscure academic journals. It came directly from one of the most celebrated moments in the history of modern science. When researchers first assembled a complete human genome at the turn of the millennium, they deliberately gathered DNA samples from people who identified with different racial backgrounds, specifically to test whether race would show up as a meaningful biological category once you actually looked at the raw genetic code. When the results were unveiled at a ceremony held at the White House, one of the pioneers of DNA sequencing stood in front of the world and delivered a conclusion that still echoes through genetics today. He stated plainly that the concept of race has no genetic or scientific basis. Not a controversial opinion, not a political statement, a direct observation based on reading the actual genetic code of human beings from across the globe. And here is a detail that tends to shock people even more than the discovery of hidden ancestry. That original human reference genome, the master genetic blueprint that scientists around the world still use today as a baseline for comparison in medical research, genetic testing, and countless other applications, was not built from a single person, and it was certainly not some idealized template of any one racial group. It was assembled from the genetic material of more than 60 different individuals. And of all those contributors, one single African American man ended up providing roughly 70% of the DNA that makes up that reference genome. His own ancestry was itself a mixture, roughly half inherited from European ancestors and half from ancestors originating in sub-Saharan Africa. The remaining portion of the reference genome came from a patchwork of contributors, including at least one person of East Asian descent and several individuals of European ancestry, along with dozens of others whose combined DNA fills out the rest of that foundational genetic map. So when people assume the reference genome that underlies modern genetic science somehow represents a single racial template, they have the story almost entirely backwards. It is, quite literally, a genetic mosaic, stitched together from a strikingly diverse group of human beings. This reality carries consequences that go far beyond interesting trivia. Because so much of modern genetic research and medical testing has historically leaned on databases that skew heavily toward people of European ancestry, doctors and researchers are only now beginning to catch up on how genetic variation actually functions across other populations. When someone of African, Asian, Native American, or Pacific Island descent undergoes genetic testing to check for inherited disease risks or to determine how their body might respond to certain medications, the results often come back murkier and less conclusive than they would for someone of European descent. Not because their DNA is somehow more complicated or mysterious, but because the reference databases scientists compare it against are still catching up to the true depth and complexity of human genetic diversity, most of which, as we now know, is concentrated in Africa. Researchers have begun pushing for increasingly diverse and specific reference genomes tailored to different population groups, an effort that could dramatically improve the accuracy of medical genetics for millions of people worldwide who have been underrepresented in the data for far too long. Consider what this actually looks like in a real hospital. A patient comes in and a doctor orders a genetic panel to check whether they carry a mutation linked to a higher risk of a particular cancer. If that patient's ancestry is well represented in existing genetic databases, the lab can usually compare their results against thousands of similar profiles and return a clear answer, either confirming a known risk variant or ruling it out with confidence. But if that same patient descends from a population that has historically been left out of large-scale genetic studies, the lab may come back with what researchers call a variant of uncertain significance, essentially a shrug written in scientific language. The mutation is there, but nobody has gathered enough comparable data yet to say for certain whether it is dangerous or completely harmless. That gap in knowledge is not a flaw in any individual person's biology, it is a flaw in the historical scope of the research itself. And it is a gap that widens the further a population's genetic diversity extends beyond what has already been cataloged, which circles right back to Africa holding more uncatalogued diversity than anywhere else on the planet. So let's bring this back to where the story started, with those 150,000 people who simply wanted a fun fact from a saliva sample and instead uncovered a piece of hidden family history. The results were not some strange anomaly floating outside the normal expectations of science. They were a small, personal snapshot of an enormous and ancient truth that population geneticists have been mapping out for decades. Human ancestry does not move in straight, isolated lines. It braids and weaves and doubles back on itself constantly, shaped by migration, war, trade, love, coercion, displacement, and simple human proximity. The idea that any group of people carries a completely separate and distinct genetic identity, sealed off from every other group, simply does not hold up once you look at the actual biological evidence. Every strand of DNA inside your body is a living historical record, quietly holding on to details that written history sometimes chooses to forget. Names get lost, records get destroyed. Communities relocate and reinvent themselves, sometimes deliberately leaving painful or complicated chapters out of the family narrative passed down to children and grandchildren. But DNA does not participate in that kind of forgetting. It simply carries forward whatever combination of ancestors actually contributed to your existence, whether or not anyone ever chose to talk about it at the dinner table. That is precisely what happened to thousands of participants in that 2014 study. Somewhere in their family's past, an ancestor's identity, an ancestor's story, and quite possibly an ancestor's entire community had been quietly folded out of the narrative. A photograph might have been thrown away. A relative might have moved to a new town and simply stopped mentioning where they came from. A marriage might have crossed a line that was, at the time, socially unacceptable or even illegal, and the family that followed chose silence over explanation. Maybe it happened because of the brutal racial classification laws that once governed who was legally permitted to identify as white in parts of the United States. Maybe it happened simply because passing generations decided certain details were easier left unspoken. Whatever the reason, the DNA remembered even when the family stories did not. And that is really the larger lesson sitting underneath all of this research, whether we are talking about hidden ancestry uncovered through consumer DNA testing, or the deeper evolutionary story of how humanity spread out from a single point of origin in Africa. Genetics keeps circling back to the same fundamental conclusion again and again. Human beings are far more connected, far more genetically intertwined, and far more descended from shared ancestry than the categories we have built to separate ourselves from each other would ever suggest. The lines we draw between groups, the boxes we check on forms, the labels we inherit from the culture and the era we happen to be born into, are real in the sense that they shape how we live, how we are treated, and how history has unfolded. But biologically, at the level of the actual code written inside every cell of your body, those lines are far blurrier, far more porous, and far more recently invented than most people ever realize. Scientists did not set out to prove any of this with some dramatic showdown or a headline built for shock value. They set out to answer a quiet, careful question, comparing what people believed about their own ancestry against what their actual DNA revealed. That question did not require sensationalism to matter. It required patience, enormous sample sizes, and years of painstaking comparison between self-reported identity and biological data, the unglamorous kind of work that rarely makes headlines on its own but ends up reshaping how an entire field understands its subject. And it is worth remembering that this kind of research is still ongoing. Every year, more genomes get sequenced, more reference databases grow richer and more representative, and more of the gaps that once left certain populations underserved by genetic medicine get filled in. The story of human ancestry is not a finished chapter sitting in some dusty study from 2014. It is a living, expanding body of evidence that keeps sharpening its picture of who we are and where we came from, one dataset at a time. And the answer that came back was more compelling than any manufactured drama could have produced. It showed that the family stories we inherit are only ever part of the picture. It showed that entire chapters of history live on inside our own bodies, waiting patiently to be read. And it showed, on a species-wide scale, that every single person walking the earth today shares a common root system that stretches back to the same continent, the same early human populations, and the same deep well of genetic diversity that all of humanity ultimately comes from. So the next time you hear someone claim that different groups of people carry fundamentally separate genetic identities, or that ancestry sorts neatly into distinct, unmixed categories, remember what the actual research shows. Remember the 150,000 participants who discovered ancestry their own families had never mentioned. Remember the genetic diversity studies that trace every population on Earth back through Africa. Remember the reference genome built from more than 60 people, its largest single contribution coming from a man whose own ancestry was already a blend of 2 continents. The results were not shocking because they revealed some hidden division buried within humanity. They were shocking because they revealed just how deeply connected we have always been, whether we knew it or not. Every strand of DNA passed down through your family carries a story older than any name on any family tree, and that story, in the end, belongs to all of us together.